Okay, well, welcome to Photography Fundamentals. This is a workshop presented by the AS Media Center, which is fully student by student funds, just for your information. We do a variety of things, including these workshops. Of course, when campus is open, we also check out media equipment. We have a studio space, meeting space. We do basically whatever we can to encourage students to be creative and help them with that creativity. My name is Andy Doerr, and I manage the Media Center. And basically what I'll be doing today is talking a little bit about how cameras work. I'll talk a little bit about the visual elements of photography, and then I'll finish it out with just some post-production considerations, basically taking a quick look at Lightroom and Photoshop and some of the things that you can do with those programs. Okay, here we go. Um, Photography fundamentals. I always start with this particular image because, for one thing, I just like the image. I like the way it's framed. I love the warmth of the colors. Um, but more importantly, it basically gives me a chance to talk a little bit about my philosophy when I'm photographing events, when I'm photographing people in general. And what I like about this image is was taken at the Pardal Carnival, which is a beginning of the year event that's put on Pardal Avenue. Pretty much takes up the whole street and includes like a mini Ferris wheel and all sorts of other rides. All of it put on by associated students to welcome both students and the community to all the services that are offered in our campus community, and in particular associated students. And, part of that is face painting. And what I like here is the way this young man is being so attentive to what he's doing as an artist. Okay. He's concentrating. He is going to do his best to paint something nice on her face, to make her look good. He's not out to make her look weird or paint something strange on there. Um, And that's kind of my philosophy of photographing people. I basically want them to look at their best, especially if I'm going to post this, you know, on online or as part of any kind of media campaign or anything like that. Obviously, if you're doing it for publicity, you do want to make sure that you're flattering everybody as best you can. On the other side of this equation, she's also trusting him to do exactly that, to take her seriously, to take his work seriously, to essentially be a professional about the work. And so there's this kind of relationship of trust that kind of goes both ways. And I think it's important to emphasize that. Now, obviously, there is also a place for what you might say is photographing people in their worst possible moments. People like Diane Arbus, did that. And in many quarters, artistic quarters, this is seen as in many ways more psychologically deep if you kind of show people looking at their worst. Personally, I think it's probably as difficult to make people look their best as it is to make people look their worst. And it's kind of up to you, and depending on the situation, what you're trying to do in terms of what you're conveying. But that's, like I say, that's the kind of basis from which I proceed with my photography. Now, as far as the technical elements of photography, that has a lot to do with, how cameras work. And basically, at its core, a modern DSLR camera or mirrorless camera, essentially a digital camera, is a really sophisticated computer, all in a very small package that's attached to a lens. And the electronic communication that goes on between the camera and the lens is essentially what gives you, kind of makes or breaks your picture it, in from the technical standpoint. Now, I'm starting with this photo partly because it allows me to talk about a number of things, which I'll then go into more detail in just a minute. First of all, the shutter release button. When you push that button on your camera, wherever it happens to be located, if you are using autofocus, you'll basically sense a little spot in there where there's a little stopping point. And basically, it's really important that you actually do stop there for like a millisecond, because it's at that point that your camera is going to do all the autofocus work. And if you're getting a lot of blurry pictures and you really can't figure out how come, it might just be because you're pushing that button too quickly and pushing through too quickly. The camera doesn't have a chance to autofocus, which also brings up the fact that if you have a camera with an attachable lens, you have to make sure if you're using autofocus that you actually have that switched on, and you probably also want to switch on image stabilization, because that helps get you more room in terms of low light photography. So that's the shutter release button. Then we have aperture, and basically what aperture determines is your depth of field. And basically what that means, it's the amount of space within the image that's going to be in focus. And the lower your aperture f-stop number, the less depth of field you're going to have. In this case, I can't remember exactly what I was shooting at, but you'll notice the two young women at the very front of the image, they're a little bit blurry. The rest of the image is pretty much sharp all the way through. So I'm probably shooting at a fairly high f-stop, and I'll get into more detail about that in just a minute. Shutter speed, what that controls is movement. And here I must have been shooting at a fast enough shutter speed, usually at least 60, but probably more if you have people moving a lot, a 60th of a second. And you can see that the people in the image, they're basically sharp. The people walking, I froze in that movement. And so the shutter speed is fast enough that the movement is frozen. Then there's ISO, which doesn't really play as much of a part here because this picture is taken in bright daylight. I'll get back into that. That has to do with the sensitivity of the sensor in the camera. And then long lenses. Generally, the longer the lens, and this really becomes an issue when you get into really long lenses, say, 200 millimeters and up or so. Basically, what they're going to do is collapse space. Because this image, for example, this is all the way from the Multicultural Center all the way to North Hall. And you can see that whole space has been collapsed considerably. At least it has that illusion. So let's get into more detail about this. So aperture, or as it's called, f-stop, determines depth of field. And once again, that has to do with how much of the image is going to be sharp. When you're shooting landscapes, you generally want a high f-stop number, kind of 8 and up to 22, 16, whatever you want to do. Basically, what that's controlling is the size of the iris in the lens. And counterintuitively, the lower the f-stop, the bigger the opening when the camera takes a picture. And that's because that's a fraction. It's a 1 over 2.8 or whatever what might happen to be. Generally speaking, when you're shooting landscapes, you're probably going to shoot at a fairly high f-stop because you want the image to be clear throughout the range of the image. Like in this one, you can see the pointer here, everything in the foreground, the horses, these trailers, all of this is pretty sharp, as is the mountain in the background. And as we'll see, if you're shooting at a lower f-stop, meaning that the iris is way open, you're going to reduce the depth of field. And we'll see that in just a minute. Now, the reason that you're able to shoot at such a high f-stop with such a small, opening to the iris, of course, is because this is taken in broad daylight. This is Mount Shasta up in Northern California. And so you're not really kind of fighting with low light. And as we'll see, that's kind of your biggest contention when you're, trying to shoot pictures, really is the light level. The other thing you might notice, this was taken with a fairly long lens. And so it looks like Mount Shasta is just like right in this valley. And that's because that long lens is collapsing the space and making that shorter. Once again, if you've just joined us, you are welcome to ask questions. Just mute yourself if there's anything that, like I say, you're just welcome to ask as we go along, and welcome to those of you who just joined. So now here we have an image. This is something of a picture that I should say pretty much all the images in this presentation are my own. And I just did that because that way I don't have to worry about copyright or anything like that. And honestly, I like my picture. So, I'm going to show off a little bit. This is a picture that I took in Istanbul, Turkey. And in this case, I actually, for one thing, was taken at night. And so the lighting is basically from street lighting. And so I've got low light. So I'm going to want to open up the aperture. So I'm going to want to shoot at a fairly low number f-stop, say 1.8, 2.8, something along those lines, so I can let more light in. But the other thing this does for me is I think you can notice that the depth of field is much narrower. So this guy is pretty much in focus. This is in focus. This whole plane in space is in focus, but the background's not. These people are kind of blurred together, as is this guy in the foreground, because I want to focus on his activity, on what he's doing, on the colors here in the center of the picture. And it's okay with me that all of this is blurry. Now, the other thing that you might notice is there's kind of a graininess in this picture, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. That has to do with ISO. That has to do with the sensitivity of the sensor in the camera, and that introduces this what's called noise. And like I say, we'll get back to that. But anyway, so this is Aperture. And another image, this is another image that I took in Puerto Vallarta. These were some traditional dancers that do performances for both street performances and on commission. But here, as in much of portrait photography, you often do want to actually reduce this depth of field because you want that psychological impact that you get by shooting at, say, again, 1.8, 2.8, what have you, because this would be a different picture if this woman in the background and all these feathers, if all this was in sharp focus, you wouldn't be as psychologically focused on the person in the foreground. Again, this was taken at night. You can see this noise that's been introduced here from the high ISO that I'm shooting at. The other thing I want to point out here, whenever you're doing portrait photography, I personally think the closer you can get in, the better. Unless there's something in the background. And here, this background does set, the figure in the foreground off. But, often we tend to include too much. And if you're shooting pictures of people, if you can get up into their faces, you often end up with a much more powerful image. Once again, here we're in Istanbul. This is the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. I might add that Istanbul is an amazing city. I hope that all of you at some point in your life get a chance to go there. Basically, I call it the Bay Area on steroids. It's on the ocean. It's a huge city. It was in its day, it was the center of the world. It was the center of the Roman Empire for many, many centuries. And it still has that kind of grandeur to it. In this case, I was taking this picture from my hotel room, which is quite a ways away, but the long lens basically collapses all of this and emphasizes the muscularity, of this mosque, which is kind of typical of Islamic architecture, this mosque architecture. They're very, like I say, they're very powerful, as opposed to Western European cathedrals that are kind of all about height, and then lift and all that stuff. But you can see both the power of the mosque itself is increased by this kind of collapse of space, and of course this background is brought in closer as we're looking across the Bosphorus to the eastern part of Istanbul. So this is an effect of long lenses. I might add that I was able to shoot at a fast enough shutter speed so that I was basically able to freeze these birds in flight pretty well. And again, that has to do with shutter speed. Speaking of which, shutter speed controls motion, okay? And that's kind of all it does. It controls how long that iris is open, which again, if you have a lot of light, this doesn't become so much of an issue. As you get into lower light, you have to shoot at slower shutter speeds, which of course is going to, if somebody's moving, you're going to pick up that movement. It becomes a challenge. But this is a windmill. This is out in the San Ynez Valley where I live outside of Solvang. And this is kind of a nice, documentary image. It has nice colors. You might notice it has a shallow depth of field. So you get this kind of background bokeh, as it's called, B-O-K-E-H, and this kind of crystalline background here. But there's not a lot of movement. I've pretty much managed to freeze this windmill using a fast enough shutter speed. It's a nice image, okay? A little slower shutter speed, and you get a very different sense of dynamism. Obviously, this is not a documentary image. If this was going to be for an ad, that you're going to put in a catalog for this windmill, you probably wouldn't use this image because the customer wouldn't be able to see, what the windmill actually looks like. You might also notice that in the background here, since this part isn't moving here in the background, this of course is pretty sharp here in the back. Whoops, let me go back this way. So that's basically, what shutter speed controls. And basically you can hand hold a camera maybe down to a 30th of a second if you're lucky, but beyond that, you pretty much have to have a tripod. And obviously, if something's moving, then you have to increase the shutter speed to capture that image. And if you're shooting sports or something like that, of course, you're shooting at very, very high shutter speed, 1600 or even beyond, as fast as you can, if you want to freeze the motion. Now, you might not want to freeze the motion, okay? These are the same dancers from Puerto Vallarta as before. And here I've slowed the shutter speed down basically because I want this kind of artistic dynamic effect, which is really more about color than, being documentary. And obviously, for artistic purposes, I think something like this works quite well. But again, if you were trying to document, what their costumes looks like and the feathers or anything like that, this would not be the way to do it. Again, this is kind of more for artistic purposes. Now, I'm assuming everything's clear from so far. I haven't heard any questions, but again, you are welcome to to ask questions if you want me to slow down, go into more detail about something. And then, of course, if you're shooting nature, if you're shooting wildlife, if you can freeze an egret like this in space, like I did at the lagoon at the university, that's a thing of beauty. And you can even get this down to the fact where it gets very, very granular. And here, at least, the eye is in focus. But here, obviously I'm shooting at a fairly fast shutter speed. I'm helped by the fact that I've got plenty of light. It's a daytime photo. And that is kind of a, if you get into wildlife photography, that's in general something you're going for is kind of, or what, nature photography or what have you, you're generally looking for this, very crisp clarity. That doesn't necessarily have to be your aesthetic. You might want to do something that's more painterly. The other thing, again, you might notice the background is totally blurred out, and that's because I'm shooting at an aperture that's small, that's big enough with a small enough f-stop that it is blurring the background so that the focus is on, this egret in flight in the middle. Okay, ISO. ISO is basically, it has to do with the sensitivity of the sensor in the camera to light. Back in the days of film, you actually had to buy different films with a different ISO. And so the film would be chemically more sensitive to light. And back in that day, I mean, getting much beyond about a 400 ISO film, you were pretty limited in your range. As digital cameras improved over the years, you can now do truly amazing things. You can get up to like 32,000 ISO. It's just, it's amazing. It really is. Digital photography has totally revolutionized what you can do with a camera. Generally speaking, depending, again, it depends on the sensor in your camera. Some of them are 3/4, some of them are um, smaller sensors. If you have a full frame sensor, that gives you more range, but as you might expect, it also means your camera is going to be more expensive. And then you're getting up closer to the kind of $2,000 range for a camera. Um, so basically, what does ISO do? ISO, if you want, generally speaking, as low an ISO as you can get, because that is going to give you the crispest, sharpest image. As you get higher in these ISO numbers, say beyond about 1600, again, depending on the camera, some of them you can even push even further than that, you're still going to get a really sharp image. But as you move up in the ISO, you are going to introduce what's called noise. And that's this, it's kind of a graininess in the film. It's not blur, it's different from blur, but it's this kind of graininess that you're going to see in here. Now, that graininess can actually be kind of nice. It can be artistic. It can kind of give the image kind of a more of a painterly feel. So it's not necessarily always a bad thing. And when you're photographing people, especially say you're at a party or whatever and you're indoors, you got low light, I generally like to bump up my ISO rather than shooting with a flash, because obviously shooting with a flash, it kind of blasts everything out. And if you don't have a filter on a flash, it's a very harsh kind of light. So if you can bump the ISO up and still get clarity, um, that's generally a good thing. You're going to get probably a warmer image. And I personally like that. And I'm not really as concerned with the ISO with this, the grain in the background that you're going to get as in this image. But all of that said, taking pictures in low light is just flat out, it's a challenge. And if anybody is moving just even a little bit, you're going to get an image like this. Now, in this case, she was under a spotlight. This was taken at a concert in the Hub many, many moons ago. But, here there was enough light. I was able to shoot at a high enough ISO to actually freeze her so she's not, particularly blurry. And I really don't care that there's a little bit of noise in this. It kind of gives that painterly effect, and it actually goes pretty well with the, the fabric of her shirt there, her blouse.
I have a quick question. Did you use a tripod for that?
No, this is all handheld.
Are all the pictures that you're showing handheld?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So far, everything has been handheld. Yeah. I don't use a tripod very often because I'm kind of a lazy photographer, honestly. But when you're shooting a concert, I mean, a tripod is just going to get in your way because you're going to want to move around.
I agree.
And so you just hope you can afford a camera with a full frame sensor so you can bring in enough light. This was not a full frame sensor, but again, because she's under a spotlight, there was enough light to freeze her.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you for the question. Thank you. Yeah, I should say if if you want tack sharp images, if you're taking landscape photos or anything like that, definitely a tripod is going to make a difference. Both a tripod and an off-camera trigger of some sort, so that you're not, and you can also lock up your mirror if you have a mirrored camera. Anything you can do to you know um, um, keep the camera from moving at all is going to give you a sharper image. Now that's something, of course, with mirrorless cameras, that goes away, this whole mirror mechanism, and so that they have an advantage in that sense. Okay, photographing people, which is something I really love to do. And this was basically, I work for Associated Students. Again, I manage the AS Media Center. And before I did that, I was sometimes tasked with taking photos of students. This was for an annual report. This is, or student events. So I went out and I photographed. This was the staff at the AS Publications, our copy shop, which, by the way, just a little plug for AS publications. If you're on campus, use them because all the money goes to students, and we are, they're definitely competitive as far as pricing and everything else. So this image, I just want to say a couple things about it. First of all, I love the warmth of this image. These are warm colors, oranges, reds, yellows, all of that are warm colors. Blues, greens, purples, those are the kind of the cooler colors. And, everything about this image just is all about warmth. I also like the fact that there's this kind of interesting background, the way this kind of cuts across her eye levels. I think that's actually kind of cool. I like the way the wind caught her hair and frames her face. I like everything about the image, but hey, guess what? There's something that I completely did not see, and I photographed several students. I don't know if any of you are seeing it. There's kind of just something that I didn't catch. If you if you see it, shout it out.
It's the plant behind her head
Yeah,
growing.
thank you. Right. She's got a bougainvillea growing out of the top of her head, right? I didn't even notice that, right? And the thing is, when you're taking pictures, no matter how long you've done this, every once in a while, you're going to make a rookie mistake like that. It's just unavoidable. Don't beat yourself up. The image does still work. Now, the other thing I want to point out, and just because of the chain of events, is when if somebody has anything written or an image on their shirt, especially if you're going to do something for publication or the media, make sure you look really closely, really at every aspect of the photo that you're going to publish. About a week after this, a young man walked into my office and he had a shirt on, a t-shirt also, and with the F word, about as big as you could possibly write it on that shirt. Obviously, that wouldn't do for publication. But I can also mention another instance where something was in an image that was about to be published, which I'm going to take credit here. I actually caught this. There was just a tiny little piece of text in the image. Otherwise, it was completely innocuous. And that piece of text was it was bad. It would have been incredibly embarrassing if this had gone to print. So be meticulous. Look at every image in your publications. Look at any text. Look at anything in there that might be offensive. That's really important if you don't want to embarrass yourself in the university in the process. So let's see, backgrounds. Okay, the other thing you're going to notice here is that she's just smack dab in the middle of the image. She's facing straight into the camera. That basically works, but guess what? You can also actually have people move around, right? You can do an over the shoulder look, like this one here. This was done by a professional photographer, Dave Palmer, who used to work over at Career Services. He did all of their publicity work. Or something like this, where he's kind of looking back at you. And believe it or not, there are actually online, you can find posing guides. And basically what those are, just Google posing guides, and they're line drawings. They're just all sorts of different ideas of how you might pose people. When I did this, I also came across one for posing bodybuilders because they have to, of course, pose in various, very specific ways. But that gives you a whole lot of different ideas. The other thing, of course, is as a photographer, you do need to control the shoot, and you need to be able to tell people, hey, I want you to do this. I'd like you to do that. And especially if you're a little bit shy about things, that's not as easy to do as you might think. Um, in that context, I would recommend that you yourself maybe subject yourself to being a model and seeing what it's like from that side of the camera, because that's also really kind of disconcerting because you don't know quite what you're supposed to do with yourself when somebody's taking pictures of you and somebody's giving you direction and so forth. So try that out, but also check out these posing guides. They'll give you a whole bunch of ideas. The other thing I want to point out here is this image is taken obviously in sunlight. And so you're going to get all these different shadows. And this is when you're in, full sunlight, this is always something you're contending with. In this image here on the left, obviously the light is much flatter. This could have been done in post-production, or he could have used a reflector to reflect light into her face to kind of flatten the light. Or he could have photographed this in what's called open shadow. And it's basically a space like a walkway, a covered walkway or something like this, where you're getting good shade. And that is also going to flatten the light. Cloudy days also, are going to give you a little flatter light. This is an image that I took at as part of a photo shoot for Gaucho Photography. We have a very active photography club on campus, and each week they gather at the AS Media Center, and we have a studio space, we have studio lights, and this is basically a product of that. This is now using studio lighting. You'll see that actually gives these catch lights in her eyes, which is actually an important thing. If you're taking pictures or doing video, bring a ring light, bring some sort of light to add some sort of light to the eyes. Otherwise, they just look dead. It's weird, especially with video. But the other thing you might notice, again, the aperture here, I was shooting at a small enough f-stop because I wanted to blur this background. This is basically a photo shoot they do each year where they basically slather paint on themselves and put up a backdrop to give this effect. The other thing you might notice about this image, it's very white. There's a lot of white light in this. It's very bright, very high, like very high key, and a lot of, like I say, it's just a lot of white. Obviously, the model is also white. And I have to say, she was a great model. I'm assuming that she maybe did some theater in high school, but basically she just lit up the camera. I might add, that is not just a matter of being attractive. There are also there are attractive people who, for whatever reason, are incredibly difficult to photograph. I mean, I'm talking about, conventionally attractive, whatever that means. I don't want to digress too far into that. And then there are people, it's if you've taken pictures of enough people, you realize this. And I don't know what exactly that is, what that magic is, but there are people who just they just light up an image frame. This is now, of course, a very different feel, a very different kind of lighting. This is something I can highly recommend. I'd never done this before, but the students, they had this, they read about this somewhere, using these little fairy lights to do the lighting. This was taken outdoors. The background here is kind of near Stork Tower. It's outside of the media center. But obviously, this has given this wonderful warm lighting. It's softened everything. And you can see, again, the little catch lights in the eye to kind of give the eyes some life. And this is shot at a very high ISO. It's not shot with a flash. And that, in this case, is what gives this, helps give this image this kind of softness that I was after in this case. Okay, group photos. Some of you might be tasked with this, to take pictures of your group. And that is a little bit like herding cats sometimes, though generally speaking, students are really enthusiastic about having their picture taken. This is something I learned as I was doing this. I'm a bit of a shy person myself, and this always kind of surprised me that people are like, yes, please take my picture. I want to be photographed. This is AS Recycling. And in this case, me or somebody had this idea, hey, what is it that is most characteristic of AS Recycling? And of course, it's these made-to-order bicycles that they use to collect recycling from all over campus. And so somebody said, hey, we should pose around this. I should say these two got clipped off because of PowerPoint. They were actually in the image. But, to pose a group with something that defines them, of course, makes the image more interesting. Now, the other thing that is kind of a miracle about this image, and this is something that is incredibly challenging when you're photographing large groups, everybody's smiling, everybody has their eyes open. It's amazing. I don't know how that even happened. And except for her, pretty much everybody is in the picture. But whenever you're doing this, make sure as you're looking through the viewfinder, look around to make sure that everybody's, in the picture. Nobody's covering anybody up. that everybody is represented adequately. A little bit more on that. Group photos. This was a group called CODA. This is our Commission on Disability Equality, another AS group, and they wanted me to take a picture of their group. So basically, I started out, with the kind of general lineup. This is back behind the media center and this nice wood grain background. I thought, why not? Pretty conventional. Somebody pointed out, yeah, but if we're going to publish this, you've got some of these people aren't in the light. I did not notice that. Okay, these are another little thing you need to figure out. But I also did some research before taking this picture. I thought, there must be something I can do on campus, find something that we can, kind of use to frame this image a little bit more interestingly. And I found this wonderful sculpture right in front of the media center. I wasn't expecting anybody to actually climb up on it, but I also know that these sculptures, they're welded, they're durable. They can take this kind of thing. So we went out front, and I have to say that also kind of loosened everybody up. This all of a sudden it becomes fun and people have a good, nice time with it. But clearly, this is a matter of just kind of framing this better. The other thing I want you to notice, I've cropped in about as tight as I can. I don't need a whole bunch of extraneous stuff in this. I want the focus to be on the people in the image. The one thing, if I was to do this again, I would do better is either in post-production, or if I had an assistant or some way of throwing light into this image with a reflector or something. Obviously, these people in here could be lit better. All right, I'm aware of that, but I just wanted to leave that in to point that out. But again, we have a little bit more interesting image this way. Okay, it's okay to ask people to pose for you. In fact, they really appreciate it when you do. This is another AS group that puts on the Pardal Center. This was at the end of the day. They've been running around all over the place. And there was a point where me, the photographer, said, hey, we need to all get together to do a group photo. Enlist somebody to go gather everybody together and take charge of the photo shoot. People really appreciate it when you do that, when you kind of at least give the impression that you know what you're doing, right? So here they are all together, in close, in a little closer. And you might notice I've kind of tilted the camera a little bit, okay? Basically what that does is adds dynamism. Anything that's kind of at a diagonal is probably going to add some dynamism to an image rather than, everything being vertical. So we kind of bump that up a little bit. And then this is Chula Vista. Sometimes people, they really want to pose for you just at random or however. So this is often not a problem. Okay, I'm noticing I'm going to speed up a little bit if I can so I can get through all of this, but this is I'm going to talk a little bit about framing. This is an image taken at Petra Jordan. Again, if you get a chance to go there, this is one of the great wonders of the world. It really is. It's a whole town that's been carved into the living rock of a red rock canyon, and it's pretty large. And you come through this slot canyon, and then you come into these carved temples. Two things I want to tell you about this place is it's actually okay to stay in there past sunset. They tell you you can't, but you actually can. I wish I had, because it was an amazing sunset. And if you can, get in as early as you can, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. I did that the following morning. I had the place totally to myself for about an hour and a half. And then the tourist hordes come and the tour buses unload everybody. I was there in the winter, so the tourists were a little bit less, but even still, it gets pretty crowded. But it is totally worth making the effort. And you can get there through Israel, or you can fly directly into Jordan. Okay, different ways of framing things. Okay, this was something I just happened to notice. This person at one of the Gaucho photography photo shoots was taking a picture of somebody else. Here's a whole bunch of different frames. Frida Kahlo, this is in Puerto Vallarta. This is a little courtyard looking through a window into a restaurant and then out into the street, which is unfortunately kind of washed out, a little too bright. But all different kinds of frames. It's kind of frames within frames. And here, this is the Maverick Saloon up in San Ynez. where basically the frame is this whole crowd of people. The other thing I want to point out, once you get to a certain place in your photography, you probably want to slap a copyright on there, even when you post online, to let people know, hey, this is your image. And if you're going to do something with it, let me know, or maybe even pay me for using the image, if that can be done. But there's all sorts of different ways to frame things. Point of view. In this case, I was asked to take a photo of another little AS Legal Resource Center, the students that work with that. And I said, hey, this is the Pardal Center out on Pardal. Why don't I get down on the ground? You get up on the second floor, and we have a little bit different image. And we also add some dynamism with these diagonals in here by framing, by these kinds of lines of force that are created through that. Again, a different point of view. This is at the SRB. And more on lines of force. This is a vineyard out in the San Ynez Valley. There's just all this movement going on with these, diagonals and curving lines that are coming through here. There's a lot of different things going on. The color, I've kind of keyed it up beyond the natural just because I felt like it. And you're totally free to do that, okay? This is what you can do in Lightroom. Or this is an image of a singer. He comes to the Topanga Banjo and Fiddle contest that happens down in Agoura Hills each year. And if you like bluegrass, if you like folk music, it's a pretty amazing event. It's like $15 to get in there for the day. And there's just all sorts of people jamming, doing all sorts of stuff. And this guy's there pretty much every year, singing along. Two-thirds rule. This is something it's sometimes called the golden section, and it just has to do with psychologically, we like images where the focal point or somehow it's broken up into about 2/3. Personally, I think it's because it kind of creates movement, it creates potential. If you have something in the center, that is about eternity. That's why often crucifixes, in churches in Italy, Christ on the cross is totally centered in kind of a triangular composition, because that's about an eternal truth, for example, or the Buddha sitting, in this very kind of centered, focused way. However, whatever image you're trying to create there, if you want that kind of image of durability or eternity, well, then center everything and make it all very symmetrical. But if you want movement, then you're going to use this two-thirds rule. So pub in Ireland, which is kind of the living room in Ireland is the pub. And then here another, this image, this was taken in Puerto Vallarta. Again, the eyes are about 2/3 of the way through the image. And that, of course, then creates creates energy. The other thing you might notice here again is a very shallow depth of field. I don't care about the back of this, my friend's head here. I care about, this is what's important in the image, is this baby. Permissions and expectations of privacy. This is really important, especially when you're doing any kind of work for the university. They are very fussy about this kind of thing. This is public affairs because they want, of course, to present the university in the best possible light. That said, technically speaking, if somebody is in a public space, they have no expectation of privacy, and therefore they are fair game. And you can put their image up on a website. You can often even use it in advertising, and that actually includes children. Obviously, depending on the event, you might want to ask folks. You might want to say, hey, is it okay if I take pictures, because I might post these online? If you're taking pictures of children in particular, of course, parents can get very, very sensitive about that, as well they should. But again, technically speaking, if you're in a public space, this is fair game. This was actually a wonderful event that happened each year, and the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, Michael Young, would officiate. It was a queer wedding. This year they started kind of making this a much smaller event, but back in its heyday, it was just a beautiful event out in Stork Plaza. Photographing children. Okay, this is also something you have to, be a little bit careful about. This was taken at an orphanage in Salamanca, Mexico. some of these children had been through things you don't even want to think about, and seen things and witnessed things. So just because they're kids and they're cute doesn't mean of obviously that they don't have a deep psychological life, and you want to be respectful of that. And these kids, this is probably, I think, the first year that I was down there. Um, pretty quickly they figured out that I'm okay, but initially, there's a, and of course there's a lot of people. Um, and that's a whole nother kind of trick to, not trick so much, but photographing people, I somehow managed, I set people at ease. I don't know exactly what I do, but I generally do. And that, obviously, you want people at ease, when you're taking pictures of them. This is out in the San Ynez Valley. This is a little parade out there. Here again, I didn't ask for permission to use this image. I don't think the parents, I'm assuming, these are the parents of at least one of the kids in here. But I love the different, kind of psychological registers of these kids and how they're dealing with this crowd of people looking at them. It really kind of ranges, all the way from this kind of more pensive to she's just, here I am. And then, mom's having a good time. Again, notice a fairly shallow depth of field. In this case, I'm okay. I mean, I want, you see that there's a crowd of people, but obviously the focus is on the front. I also love kind of the pinkness of this image. That's kind of it's just pretty. It's a pretty image. Okay, post-production, and we're just going to kind of fly through this, but all I want to do here is kind of show you what Lightroom and Photoshop can do and what they're for. Lightroom is basically, for one thing, it's to archive your films and your images, and it's a great program for that. The main thing to know about Lightroom in that context is it does not store your images. Okay, you're going to store your images either on your computer or as you get more images, you're going to store on an external hard drive. Lightroom communicates with those images in the hard drive, and all it does is, what you're doing when you're processing an image in Lightroom is you're creating instructions for that image, so that when the image is then processed or sent out online or is printed, it comes with these instructions. Okay, and those instructions are stored, but not the image itself. It's really important to know that, because if you upgrade your Lightroom, you might end up losing some of your images if you don't have them stored somewhere else, actually stored somewhere. Now, that actually brings up another thing, which I didn't mention, is as you get better at photography, you definitely want to shoot in what's called RAW. And RAW makes much bigger images, but it also keeps way more information. It gives you much more flexibility in post-processing. You can also, of course, post-process JPEGs, and that's fine, or TIFF files or various other file formats, but RAW is the best. I tell my program to actually convert those to something called DNG, because each different camera manufacturer has a different kind of RAW image. DNG is a universal language, so to speak. And so that's what I generally do. But you do get big images, and that's why you're probably going to go to an external hard drive at some point. This is White Sands, New Mexico, and it really is white. It's a gigantic gypsum desert. My son was actually based in the Air Force out there at Alamogordo, New Mexico for way too many years. But this isn't a pretty amazing place. And yes, the sand is white, though you might notice even here, this isn't, 100% white, just the way it's processed. But this is also white sands, okay, after I've done a whole bunch of processing in Lightroom. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to have a whole bunch of different things you can adjust. And I generally, more often, I just kind of start at the top and work my way through all the different things, exposure, contrast, shadows, highlights, all of these different things, clarity, all that stuff, color adjustments, all of those things, and just go through it and see what you like. That's really up to you. You're the artist. You have kind of total control of all of this. And you can also actually print various stages of this, right? You don't have to just do the final product. There's a history panel, so you can go back, through the various stages of this, depending on what you're after. Now, the other thing, that you're going to do in Lightroom is you're going to probably crop your image. This was taken up in the Canadian Rockies, um, and this is in Alberta, the Icefields Parkway, which is one of the most amazing roads on earth. It really is. You can just don't even have to get out of your car pretty much. But this is Peyto Lake, very well known for its, the color of the lake. And of course, a lot of tourists go there. And a lot of tourists go there because it's really amazing. So, get ready. Obviously you have to deal with all the tourists, but you can, of course, and sometimes you want to document that. Yeah, it's kind of cool having people in there experiencing that with you. But, here I am, the first explorer of Canada or an Indigenous person in Canada. And there's really no hint of other people here. I'm the first person that ever saw this. And I've also brightened everything up. I've worked, the highlights, the shadows, all of this stuff to kind of make this image crisper. And this is what you basically do in Lightroom. You do all those color adjustments, lighting adjustments, contrast, all of that stuff. That's what you do in Lightroom. You can play around with, well, color. This is a student march. Why not black and white? Make it look more like an image, a newspaper image. And then we have Photoshop. Photoshop, the power of Photoshop is that you are working in layers. And what that means is basically it's like a bunch of pieces of glass or plastic that you can create, and you can create as many layers as you want. But what that allows you to do is make these what are called composite images, or to make adjustments without being destructive. That's another thing about Lightroom. Because it's just giving instructions to the image, it's completely non-destructive. The core image is always still there. You haven't changed anything. In Photoshop, you can actually take pieces out and they're gone forever. But you can also work in layers so that you do your adjustments in a different layer than the original image. And then that gets overlaid onto the image. You can also make images like this. I took a trip up to Cambria, up to Piedras Blancas, the sea lions up there, which the elephant seals, excuse me, which by the way, right now have to have their pups. If you can get up there, this is the time to do it. And I'm just going to take this image apart so you can see what this is composed of. This is from Harmony, the little town of Harmony. Totally worth a stop, about half hour, 45 minutes. Its population is 17. There's a wine tasting room up there. They also have ice cream, and they have a really nice glass blowing workshop. So this is the little chapel, which you can rent the whole town to get married up there if you want. This is the chapel, the outdoors. You notice the inside's all dark. Well, so there's the inside. That's what it looks like on the inside, just focusing on that. There's another layer taken at the beach up at Piedras Blancas. And there's another layer of just a little bit of ocean. And when all that comes together, there are all the different parts, okay? This is just basically for fun, and you can experiment with this. You can adjust the opacity of the various layers. You can cut out parts. I had to work to kind of get this to look realistic. You want to be concerned with shadows, so the shadows are natural, and you can manipulate all of that using these various adjustment layers. Or something like this, more painterly. This is an image taken up in Idaho, and there's also some roofing of an old cabin. This is a creek. All of this together and different levels of opacity create this composite image. And then you can use different filters and just get creative. This is a heron. This was right at the lagoon. I got lucky. I think this heron might have been sick. It didn't move. It was still gorgeous, but try something, do some vignetting. Black and white, why not? And then here's a program that turns your images into watercolors. Worked great on a heron, did not work on the landscape, but again, these are all things that you can play around in post-production. Just a quick little thing, if you're going to do anything for publicity, make sure that your type does not get lost in the background. Make sure it's big enough. Make sure that you communicate with your graphic designer. It's okay to do that and tell them, hey, this is really not reading properly. Graphic design is about communications. It's art, but it's not. It's about communicating. And if the font's too small, if the colors aren't right, it's okay to, to tell your graphic designer that and give them feedback to get them on track. And then finally, photography is all about telling stories. And, in many cases, you're just taking snapshots. In other cases, you do want to tell a story. You want to kind of have some sort of narrative. Hey, this is a family event. These are the different parts of the event. The other thing you have to think about is, am I just taking snapshots? Am I documenting something? Or am I trying to make art? Am I really trying to make something high art? And that's a different process, documenting versus high art. This, I wasn't really thinking about narrative, but when I saw the image, I love the way there's all these little things going on, right? Over here, there's some people taking pictures. These folks are just talking. These folks are kind of hanging out. These women are, she must have noticed that I was taking the picture. There's even a guy swimming over here. There's all these little narrative stories that are in this image. This is at the beach in Puerto Vallarta. And then finally, just keep experimenting. Practice, practice, practice. Take as many pictures as you can. That is one of the huge advantages of digital photography. When you're at an event, take a ton of pictures. They don't cost you anything, right? The only thing that they're going to do is probably take up storage space on your computer or your hard drive, but there's really no reason not to. Back in the film days, well, film was expensive, but with digital images, go for it. I don't want to get into the whole debate about mirrorless cameras versus DSLRs, single lens reflex cameras. That's a whole nother issue. Digital cameras in general are amazing. They're just amazing machines, amazing tools for your creativity. Any questions after all of that? Thank you all for listening. And anything that I can, that you'd like me to elaborate on. Okay, I guess not. Well, thank you for stopping in. We are working on getting these workshops up on the, there are a lot of resources. One of them is actually out the Media Center website. If you click on the Learning Center tab, there's a whole bunch of online resources. I've been developing that since this past March. There's just a long list of different kinds, for software, for taking pictures. I also want to give a plug to the SB Creative Lab. This is a group of students who, on their own initiative, created a really nice space where they also do some really nice tutorials. Again, also Adobe, of course, is a great resource. If you are an employee, you also have, of course, free access to lynda.com, which is now LinkedIn Learning. Adobe, if you're a student, it's $20, I think, for the entire Adobe Creative Suite per month. You do have to pay for the whole year, but it's a pretty darn good deal. And you're always welcome to contact the Media Center. Just go to our website and contact us. We're glad. We have staff. We have a graphic designer. We have a web developer. We have me. All of us, we're glad to help out if you have anything that you need help with down the line. So please do contact us. That's just media.center@as.ucsb.edu. That's the email address, and all of that's also on the website. Thanks again for stopping in. Once again, last chance. Any questions?
Thank you for sharing.
Okay, thank you for stopping in. Have a good year.